The literature of the ancient world, particularly starting in the Bronze Age, is full, if not rich, of all sorts of mentions of homoerotic attraction and in general same-sex relationships. In other words, same-sex attraction is definitely not a modern invention, it's not a modern thing, and I want to go out on a limb and say that it's probably as ancient as mankind itself. But what about homosexual marriage, or in general same-sex marriage? Is that a modern invention, or do we have evidence of homosexual marriages in the ancient period? As I have demonstrated over and over again on this channel, this is the one channel that does not have any agenda and does not try to push any ideology. Namely, I tell it how it is. So what do the sources say? Let's talk about it. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and one of the earliest, most explicit examples and mentions of a homoerotic relationship is between the Mesopotamian hero Gilgamesh and his lover, Enkidu. The theme and the idea of the hero and his companion at arms, connected by a brotherly love so deep as to enter the sphere of sexual attraction, is in fact a pretty common element in several classics in ancient literature, sometimes explicit, other times less so. It of course goes without say that, even in the ancient period, brotherly love or friendship in arms doesn't always or necessarily mean that we are in the presence of homoerotic attraction. However, different cultures understood this sort of love in very different ways throughout the centuries. And since today our question is rather specific, since we actually want to know about marriage, so something that is institutionalized within a society by law, our investigation will not only be interdisciplinary, but we will be discussing several civilizations, in fact, these five: the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks, Mesopotamia, the Hittites, and ancient Egypt. When talking about same-sex relationships in the ancient world, one of the things we need to understand is that there are several aspects that need to be taken into consideration in order to make sure that we don't fall into the easy mistake of just expecting homosexual relationships to be understood, approached, and lived in the same way they would be, not only now specifically, but in general, for example, in the 20th century. To understand how same-sex love was perceived by the ancients, we need to discuss this topic from an anthropological, cultural, and ritualistic aspect. But with that out of the way, one thing we can absolutely state with confidence is that the ancients were not extraneous to the concepts of same-sex love. But such relationships were not as free as one might expect, as they were in fact regulated by specific societal conventions, which would render them lawful in some situations and illicit in other situations, sometimes frowned upon by society, and other times encouraged or used to boast. To be more specific, passive homosexuality tended to be stigmatized and only considered to be lawful, according to at least some people, either for the very young, like in the case of some Greeks, or the very old, as it would be the case for the Norse. This could be considered to be a generalization of the condition of same-sex relationships in the ancient world drawn in broad lines. And it acts as a basis for our next question, which is the title of this video. What about same-sex marriage? Within the Mesopotamian world, the question relating to homosexual marriage isn't the clearest one. In fact, the type of information we have in general on this topic when it comes to the past is rather fragmentary. But we do have some magic formula which we find present in the Almanac of Incantation from the 2nd millennium BC that can give us some very interesting information on this topic. It appears in fact that these forms of magical incantations favored love between a man and a woman to a man, but also of a man towards another man. And regardless of how interesting of a piece of information this may be, it does not specifically talk about a legalized marriage in the sense of a contract. The first explicit reference to a homosexual marriage during the Bronze Age comes from the Hittite world. The first tablet of the Hittite laws, created between 1650 BC to 1500 BC, was specifically used for regulatory legislations when it comes to matrimony. and it talks specifically about the rules when it comes to the payment of the dowry, so an amount of money from the husband to the wife or the wife's family. Special arrangements present and discussed in Tablet 1 conceded explicit legal authority also to slaves when it comes to procuring a wife to themselves. We read, "If a slave gives a dowry to a woman and takes her as a wife, no one must force him to give her back." This is from section 34. Now check out section 36. If a slave gives the dowry to a young man and takes him to live with him in his own house as his spouse, no one must force him to give him back. So, what this means is that, at least in the Hittite world, if a male slave was going to give money to another man because he wanted to marry him, then this transaction would have been legal and protected by the law. Now, unfortunately, the only piece of evidence we have is this one specifically talking about slaves, but then again, if slaves are allowed to do something, logically speaking, in the majority of cases it can also be implied that a free man could have done the same within that society. Now, when we approach classical literature and specific political discussions on the ancient world, both in ancient Rome and in ancient Greece, the idea of homosexual love is mentioned, talked about all over the place, specifically in Plato. But this does not mean that the ancient Greeks would have been favorable to the idea of homosexual marriage. In fact, it is in ancient Rome that we find the only actual examples of homosexual marriage between men. And they are both trying to portray the homosexual marriages of Emperor Nero and the homosexual marriages of Emperor Elagabalus. Now, when it comes to, I said it once in Latin, I'm just going to say it in English, Elagabalus. When it comes to him, I have a dedicated video, so I'm not going to go into it again. You'll find a link in the description below. But since that video was dedicated to Elagabalus, I did not mention Nero. And Nero did marry a man. Let's read it. This is reported by Cassius Dio, and it talks about how after the death of his wife, Sabina, whom he himself had killed out of anger, since he was missing her, he decided to marry a woman, a young woman that looked like her. After which, however, he had a young Libertus castrated, his name was Sporo, because he also looked like Sabina, and treated him in any way as a wife. With time, even though he had already been married to a Liberto by the name of Pythagora, Nero formally married Sporo and gave him a dowry according to contract law. So if you notice, not only we have a mention of a marriage that is formally done through the law, but we have a mention of a marriage before with another Libertus by the name of Pythagora. In that specific case, Cassius Dio is mentioning Tacitus. So even though we do have evidence of homosexual marriage, these, as we read them through the literature and the perspective of the time, are always considered as a form of extravaganza. These not only are not the norm, but we have no reason to believe the regular people had access to such exotic behaviors, and when I say exotic, I specifically talk about Elagabalus, but also Nero. So what I'm trying to say is, these are emperors, they're powerful men, and they could do whatever they wanted, including defying established law or established customs, and nobody could say anything. Well, until they killed Elagabalus, that is. And when it comes to the extravagant nature of such unions, still we are told that during this first marriage between Emperor Nero and the Libertus Pythagora, they had a feast, and what we are told during the chronicles of this event is that all sorts of very promiscuous activities occurred. We read, Nero himself, contaminated by all sorts of natural and unnatural desires, did not save any abomination to complete his depraved existence, and after a few days he became officially, with all the rights and legitimacy of marriage, the wife of Pythagora. A veil covered the imperial head. Witnesses were invited to the place. The dowry, the marriage bed, the marriage torches were all there. Everything, in substance, that a woman would want as she became a wife was given and openly showed. Now, did this actually happen? I'm inclined to believe so, mostly because we have more than one mention. As we see, we have the indirect mention of Cassius Dio, we have the direct mention of Tacitus, but on top of that, Suetonius mentions this as well, even though he doesn't give the Libertus the name Pythagora, but calls him Doriforo. However, it's important to underline that as we read these sources, they are clearly trying to paint the emperors in the most negative light possible. But regardless of that, still there is precedent. This allegedly happened. So what about the regular people? Could people who did not have the power of an emperor marry a person of the same sex if they so chose? Legally speaking. Roman legislation does not seem to contemplate or include the possibility of homosexual marriage, and the situation with Nero does seem to be a form of extravagant behavior. Regardless of that, there is one passage that I think could be very interesting to mention, and that is from the Theodosian Code of 342 AD. This is once again a law that kind of depicts the situation of homosexual marriage in negative light. I mean, this happens a lot. Same-sex attracted people always had to struggle throughout the centuries, that is a fact. And trying to say otherwise does not do any favor to anyone. However, there are two possible interpretations of this law, so I want to give them both. Regardless, in the first interpretation or translation of this law, it would be a legislation or a maneuver that is trying to prohibit homosexual marriage. So, if the government feels the need to prohibit something, it means that very thing was in fact done by the people, and at least to a certain numerical level to have them involved. However, a secondary interpretation of this law gives us the idea that perhaps they weren't trying to ban homosexual marriage, but homosexual relationships instead. Now, which one is the correct translation? Very difficult to know, so I'll leave them both to you for your own personal research. Now that we have discussed the ancient world, there is a thing or two that we have to say about the medieval period. Now, clearly, in medieval Europe, with the rise of Christianity, homosexual relationships become something that needs to be done in secret. So, same-sex lovers have to hide it or be persecuted for it. With that being said, if you are familiar with not only legal codex, but specifically ecclesiastic ones, you might have heard a word, adelphopoiesis. Let's talk about it. Within medieval archival history, it is possible to run into a certain type of document which specifically talks about a kind of legal union between two men ratified within the ecclesiastical world. These would include the creation of a very strong relationship, which also had economic implications, and the men that were joining in these kind of rapports were promising to take care of each other, to share their income and work equally. And what's interesting about the adelphopoiesis is that it also worked as a will, in the sense that if one of the two men were to die, the other one would inherit at least part of the other man's heritage or patrimony. So, at least from a formal perspective, the practice of adelphopoiesis does remind us very much in its structure that of marriage. And there is a specific historiographical modern school of thought that supports this idea, the main representative being John Boswell from the University of Yale. He is one of the first to propose the idea of identifying this specific kind of union with an actual homosexual union. It is, however, important to say that this specific position is not shared by the majority of historians. That is because they consider adelphopoiesis as an institutionalized form of political, commercial joint venture, military establishment, or even brotherly love. And what's interesting is that the origins of such a union between men was not in fact to be found within the Christian church of the medieval period, but instead in the pagan pre-existing cultures, mostly in Eastern Europe within the Orthodox Church, but also within the Catholic Church in the West. The etymology of the word also meaning to make a brother. And even though there are definitely connections to the Central Slavic world, as I was mentioning, there is at least one occurrence that we know of within the ecclesiastical Catholic world, exemplified in a document found in the monastery of Celanova in Spain, which today can be observed in the Historic National Archive of Madrid, a union between Pedro Diaz and Muñoz van stipulated on the 16th of April 1061. It is my opinion that as a societal, specifically ecclesiastical practice, this was not intended to be sexual in nature, also because it is often underlined that such unions were to be similar to those of the saints. With that being said, I would like to leave you with this thought for you to ponder. Considering the fact that, as we said, homosexual couples and same-sex attraction and love absolutely existed in the medieval period and needed to be kept secret, is it really so impossible to believe that perhaps some men used this structure pretending for it to be some sort of brotherly love, but in reality they were an actual couple, they just didn't tell the church? Having a look in the world of ancient Egypt and trying to understand how the situation was, well, we don't have a lot of testimonies that really tell us about a specific legal ability to marry, for example, another man, or for a woman to marry another woman. However, there is an indirect mentioning, which we might want to look at. A certain level of connection and interaction between the ancient Israelites in biblical literature and ancient Egypt is well known, and specifically in the book of Leviticus we have some mentions of homosexuality within the biblical text, which we are now discussing from a secular perspective only. Now, rather than reading the book of Leviticus itself, which is something I usually do on this channel, jumping directly into interlinear, so we normally examine word by word the Hebrew text, but that's for a separate series. By the way, link in the description to the episodes if you're interested. The connection I have to today's topic has to do with rabbinic literature instead. In the book of Sifra, as a commentary, we could say, to the information and commandments given in the book of Leviticus, we read, "You will not copy the practices of the land of Egypt and of the land of Canaan, and you will not follow their laws." So, what are these laws? Well, let's read. A man would marry a man, and a woman would marry a woman, and a man would marry a woman and her daughter, or a woman being married by two men. So if we were to believe this interpretation and examination of the book of Leviticus, which we find in the Sifra, it would point us to the idea that both Egyptians and Canaanians by law allowed these kind of marriages to happen. It is, however, important to underline the fact that since this is a book that was created externally to the cultures that we are discussing, we don't know if this was some sort of slander or an attempt at discussing customs that the author was trying to push as inappropriate, specifically because foreign. So it's a pretty weak point of reference, but I thought it was interesting to mention. Well, as always, let me know what you think about this very question and in general this topic in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching. If you're not a member of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.